So we now move to our workshops, and I'm going to invite our first speaker, Dr. Eve Poole, to give a very quick overview of what her workshop's going to be involved in. Dr. Eve Poole teaches leadership and ethics at Ashridge Business School. She is an Associate Research Fellow of the William Temple Foundation and Chair of Faith in Business at Ridley Hall in Cambridge. She has worked both in the church and in the city and writes about theology and capitalism. Eve, thank you.
Thank you. I'm the first of the big up female boffins. I realise it's quite dangerous territory because at Ashridge we have a saying that it's about 12 minutes past 2, the average time at which people fall asleep after lunch. And I've chosen, by way of introduction to my workshop, to give you a bit of theology. So do feel free to just fall asleep now if you'd like. But being from a business school and being in a museum, I thought we should do an installation rather than me just talk. Hence flip chart. Now, someone from business school could not come and be here for more than a couple of minutes without drawing a 2x2 matrix, so hang on a tick. What you need to know about me is that in the midst of my PhD I was rather struggling, so I spent 5 weeks in a monastery searching for inspiration. It was a silent order, and I'm an extrovert, so you can imagine it was quite tough. So I was quite industrious and decided what I was going to do is analyse the whole of theology ever and create a matrix for it. So I thought you might be intrigued by that because it, first of all, gives you great bullshit quality ways of analysing everyone you've ever hated theologically and telling them why their theology is rather deficient. So in the area of political economy, we do have a bit of a presenting problem with theology because, frankly, having spent a long number of years analysing it, there is a bit of an issue about quality, depth and coverage. But there are lots of good reasons for that. So I thought if I introduced that briefly and then said what we're actually going to spend the workshop discussing, that might give you a way in. So first of all, theology tends to be stuff about God, either to do with what we should believe, how we should behave, all that kind of stuff, or about how to do theology anyway. So I'm going to put some names up here. So this is content theology, about what we should believe and why, and process theology, which is how we should go about doing that. And we tend to address these to two broad audiences. One is sort of what Rowan Williams would call family speak, which is talking about theology in a church context. And one, particularly if we're talking about political economy, is talking to the wider world, which may include some of those church members and people of other faiths who may have something in common in terms of perspective, but you have what they would call an asymmetric belief context, so you can't assume that you share the same undergirding. So I'll call that world. Now, what's brilliant about this matrix is lots of very famous and brilliant people have come up with loads of monikers for the sorts of theology that occurs in these boxes. And you might want to spend a bit of time thinking about which box you might primarily operate in. So this one is preaching to the converted. And that's what a lot of theology is for. It's why we have hymns, it's why we have stained glass windows and beautiful architecture for when people couldn't read and couldn't have access to a Bible because it wasn't translated. It's why we have worship and liturgy. It's all the sort of witnessing and worshipping, prayer, praise, all those kinds of activities we do, which is stuff about God that we do with each other because we all believe together. So that's what Rowan Williams would call the sort of family chat and family activity. So frightfully brainy theologians like me and most of you here go off to universities to study the thing technically, which is where we get into what they call sharpening the pencil. And this is where philosophical theology comes in. And this is the sort of idling of the motors, it's the hovering above theology to check its health, it's where you find worries about doctrine, systematics, all those kinds of disciplines where we're trying to figure out, have we got this right and is that heretical, and let's have a few conferences about it and throw half the church out and disallow half the Bible and all that kind of stuff, which is trying to keep an eye on this kind of stuff to make sure it doesn't get infected and that it keeps clean. So what tends to happen is a sort of oscillation between these two, and you can see in the history of the church and theology that has been the case. There have been things that have been sort of sent up to academics to fix, and then they come back again, and we ditch the filioque clause, or we have another schism about it, or something like that. So there's quite a lot of a tradition around those two bits of theology. And then what happens is people notice that not everyone has the same belief system, so they start trying to figure out how would you talk to people who don't really share your views on this thing. So this is, I guess, where we get into Wittgenstein's language games, and there's a whole load of different ways of explaining what we do here. It might be metaphysics, it might be sociology, it might be psychology or transpersonal psychology or spirituality, it could just be ethnicity and history and cultural studies, but it's some sort of secular-ish ways of trying to explain what we're up to theologically in a way so as not to offend people who may not share our views. Now, this is quite a productive place to be in. It's certainly where Temple really pushed a lot of his work around the middle axiom tradition that so many people here exemplify in the way they approach things and they write. Also, his enthusiasm for ecumenism is a way of trying to figure out how do we keep reliable witnesses of our tradition and keep true to that, but in a world where not everybody receives us or understands what we're on about. Geoffrey Stout in Ethics After Babel, though, said there's a bit of a tendency here to clear our throats and not actually say anything. So I'm going to call this the clearing the throat section. And of course, the problem about all of this, whether or not you are an evangelical, whether you just think that actually witnessing and creating the kingdom around you is really important, is the point of a lot of this stuff. The worship, prayer, and praise is important, along with the angels and everybody else is up to it. But an awful lot of this is about trying to transform the world around you. So this box is a bit problematic, because actually it doesn't tend to be populated by very much. So if you think about examples of church or theologians doing God in the world, it's quite instructive to try and figure out how you would populate that, because what tends to happen is one of two routes. Quite a lot of idling of motors and talking about how theoretically we might talk to them if we were allowed to, and lots of very complicated names for that, dialogue at traditionalism, middle axioms, or interfaith dialogue, and a whole load of kind of protocols, should we ever talk to any of these people. And a huge number of books that I read were really trying to get this absolutely right without actually then doing it. Or you get that very common sort of Britisher abroad thing, which is you use this and you say it extremely loudly and very slowly, and you hope they'll sort of get it. And that tends to be the sort of way that we do theology to do with political economy. Now, luckily, I've got some examples on the panel here of when the church is already doing this really well, but doesn't necessarily call it theology in this space. So one example would be the food banks, which is theological activity in public, in asymmetric faith contexts, which is about bearing witness to what we all believe. So it's trying to live out this stuff in a kind of context where not everybody signs up to your way of thinking. I would say that fair trade and all the support the churches gave on that would be an example of this too. And we heard a lot earlier about love and about Temple on love. And I think all those examples of witnessing and being Christian without needing to compel other people to share your views are examples of that. And it gets very tricky in this space because it is very contested. In the other spaces, you've got quite a lot of authority. We heard this morning Lord Plant talking about warrants and backings, and where do you stop when people say why? And of course, in the top half, everybody around you also believes in God. So you say, well, because God says, and you might have a fight about which bit of the Bible or whatever, but you generally have a sort of shared grounding. The problem about the bottom half is that you don't necessarily have any shared warrant and backing. So the person of the messenger becomes really important, which I think is why we tend to stray away from this box, because you do have to be out there and say, because I say so and this is why. And that's when it gets very tricky, because you do get into arguing about who's right and why. Now, what I'd like us to talk about in our workshop, and I'm ably aided and abetted by Ian Steedman and John Atherton, who will also open the workshop by saying a few words, is to talk about how we might puzzle out this space well then. And I have a clue from the work I've done about how we might do that well, which is how do you cross these boundaries so they don't feel like big walls you have to scale. They just feel like porous boundaries that we can oscillate back and forth. And I think it's to do with mood, because the other thing I picked up about theology is a lot of it is either indicative or imperative. This is what we believe, or thou shalt. In fact, if all you do, rather than the sort of speaking slowly and more loudly, is change the mood of what you say, so you're asking questions, you're using the subjunctive, using the optative to talk about hopes and dreams, you have a totally different conversation. So what would the economy look like if it was run by angels? That's one example of a question which might seem whimsical, but isn't one that we often ask. So if you're curious about the economy and how we, as people who believe in God, do that faithfully and do it well and do it loudly and effectively, then come to our workshop and we'll talk to you about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve, very much indeed. So for a taste of workshop 2, faith-based engagement in civil society, Chris Mould is going to introduce that. Chris is chairman of the Trussell Trust, a charity founded on Christian principles which tackles poverty and exclusion in the UK and Bulgaria. The Trussell Trust works with churches and community centres to provide 420 food banks across the UK.
Thank you very much. I just checked the volume. Can people hear me all right? Good, excellent. A couple of years ago, I did a Newsnight interview. I was being interviewed, and we were talking about Food Bank, the massive growth of Food Bank and the need for it. Came to the end of the broadcast, Jeremy Paxman and others stepped off the stage with their guests, and he took me aside, Jeremy Paxman, and said, "I've recently become an atheist. And I don't get it, but you Christians are all over this space. Can you explain why? I still do homelessness," he says, "and I don't see why others don't follow me." You know, that was his question. I said to him, well, you know, think about it seriously. We've just been talking about 400 plus food banks, a massive movement led by churches. How many atheist soup kitchens do you find around the country? And he said, good point. We had an interesting conversation. I am passionately clear in my own mind that faith-based engagement in civic society is critical to the survival of a civic society which is fair to all, and it is in danger. The Food Bank network started as Trussell Trust doing something in its own city in Salisbury in the year 2000. 3 years later, after running a pilot project for 3 years and evaluating it carefully, we decided to replicate it across the country. Today, there are more than 436 food banks launched by the Trussell Trust, but much more importantly, that means that you can access Trussell Trust style food support in over 1,200 locations in the country. Over 12,000 churches are involved in our network, involved in those 1,200 locations. Over 8,000 schools are formally involved in helping to provide food. In 2013-14, we provided emergency food support, at least 3 days of emergency food for over 900,000 people. All of them were referred to us. They were given vouchers by professionals in the caring area who said these people need help and they need it now. Over 30,000 people around this country, at least half of them employed by the state, health visitors, doctors, social workers, hold those vouchers, Trussell Trust vouchers, and are using them day in, day out. This is 10 years on from a local project started by some Christians in Salisbury. The scale, the influence and the impact are significant. The potential for us to influence civic society in a positive fashion is huge. We managed to do some of what we should be doing as a consequence of our credibility gained because tens of thousands of people volunteer in food banks and do something that people see as worth doing. And that's the issue that I want to explore in the workshop, is how do we do the two key things: deliver something worth delivering in a way which is distinctly the consequence of our faith base, and secondly, How do we make sure that other people recognise, firstly, that it's good, and secondly, that there is a reason why it's good, so they understand the connection back to the faith? I had to do a series of interviews a short while back on the radio. It was a debate, and we had this thing the BBC do where they organise all sorts of regional interviews, one after the other. The debate was between me and the director of the British Humanist Association, because they had just produced a press release that said this food bank movement run by the Trussell Trust, is dangerous to society. It's not neutral, it's bad. It's bad because these people are Christians. And this is not how things should be in our post-Christian world. They didn't have any very good examples of why they thought it was dangerous beyond the fact that they believed that we wouldn't give a gay person food, which was easy to deal with because, of course, we give anybody help who's referred by any of those 30,000 plus people who've never had to sign a form to say they're Christians in the first place. So, but there was a very interesting debate about why they thought it was dangerous. So we'll be taking a look in the workshop at how we do this thing collaboratively, with humility, recognizing that not everybody agrees with what we think, and how we maintain positive relationships. Over 4 million citizens in the UK last year donated food to a Trussell Trust food bank. At least 4 million people. That is a fairly powerful sign that the public care about their communities and that faith-based organisations can galvanise, touch something in the hearts of people to the point where they take action. So the last thing we'll be looking at is how we deal with this tension between being collaborative, being very inclusive, and being courageous and open about the fact that we believe the faith base, which is motivating the action, is why the action is good quality, effective, and why we should see more of it.
Thanks, Chris, very much. So for a taster for Workshop 3, I'm going to invite Anna Ruddick to come to the microphone. Anna is a freelance trainer, researcher and facilitator, supporting Christians to engage with their local communities. Most recently, she was working with the Eden Network and Livability. She also undertakes doctoral work at the University of Chester. Anna.
Thanks very much. So, all right. I will be using, I think, this gadget to move a little PowerPoint along for you. Very briefly then, so our workshop, and it'd be myself with John Reader, who will kick off our discussion once we get into our group. Essentially, we're going to be discussing some questions really around new ecclesiologies and community empowerment. Really, my questions are, what do we mean by new ecclesiologies? And actually, do we mean the right kind of things by community empowerment? So I want to just spend a couple of minutes unpacking those initial thoughts, and the workshop will be very discussion-based, so we will literally have some space to process all that you've heard this morning, and then to really apply that within the context of forms of church and how we might actually enable communities to be all that they can be. So firstly, new forms of church. For me, I think new forms of church really are about new ways to be strange. Over recent years, a plethora of new ways to be strange in relation to church have sprung up. You've got simple church, pioneer mission, fresh expressions, incarnational ministry, missional communities, mission-shaped communities, emergent church, organic church, cafe church. The list goes on and on and on. And really, these things, these labels, all try to articulate and attempt to do something different from what has gone before in a particular church context. These things can't claim to be new, and many of you, particularly from more inherited church traditions, will be thinking, oh, this is not a new thing. And you're right, we can't claim to be new in many of these different ways, but they are strange in their contexts. And that, I think, is important for us to think about. At their best, new forms of church as they begin to emerge are not just novelty for their own sake, or because we're too impatient to stick with a methodology for long enough for it to bear fruit. At their best, new forms of church, I think, can be a genuine attempt to discover or rediscover the strangeness of the incarnation in a new place, a new time, of God made flesh. So the Missio Dei shift theologically over the last 10, 20 years has both arisen from experience and speaks back to experience. Where do we see God already at work? How can we follow him in engagement with our communities? So just as a snippet, what do these new ecclesiologies have to say to the world around them, their communities, and to inherited ways of being church? Well, for my money, and in my experience, I would say a few things. Firstly, they have to say that vulnerability is godly. Vulnerability is godly. And that's a lesson, particularly in community engagement, that it's important and vital for us to learn. Secondly, God can be found in attention to and love of the details of everyday life. Thirdly, that God's mission is holistic. Any sacred-secular divide is fictional. And fourthly, that God is in pursuit. That he is beyond inclusive. He is pursuing, searching out the other, in order to restore relationships. So that's a few thoughts on new forms of church. So what about community empowerment? What do we mean by that? The experience of dependence as a fact of life is widespread, particularly among marginalised communities, which is where most of my experience lies. And new forms of church have often emerged in those areas in a way to respond to marginalisation, where the harshness of the context demands new questions to be asked of church communities. However, my experience, and the experience of those that I've worked with, is that building relationships without an awareness of the dynamics of dependence leads not to any kind of transformation, but simply to a fitting in, a temporary remodelling of lives in what is often a middle-class image of faith. And our response to dependence is often the language of empowerment. What we want is for people to be empowered. It's often the language that we use in all sorts of sectors, both faith and in local government. However, I suggest that there are risks inherent in an empowerment approach, which are highlighted by our gospel, and therefore which mean we should ask critical questions of this language. Very briefly, empowerment is individualistic. It reflects a personal journey of an increasing sense of power. Is that really what we're aiming at? Secondly, gaining power suggests a position of over something or someone else. Empowerment positions us in a combative rather than collaborative stance towards others. And I think the concept of empowerment struggles in the face of the uncontrollable situations of life. The reality is that we are all not in control of many of the big issues and impacts upon our lives. And by introducing people to a sense of their own power as a solution to dependence, do we not make them vulnerable then to disappointment when they become subject to events outside of their control, their actual powerlessness? My suggestion is that the language of significance might offer a better hope for a route out of dependence, the discovery of a person that they matter. Significance is corporate. It's collaborative rather than competitive. It's inclusive. It doesn't depend on the insignificance of others. It can also be resilient in the face of the uncontrollable in life. Significance doesn't make us passive. Rather, it highlights the importance of our responses and actions despite our lack of ultimate control over many life events. I think a focus on personal significance enables dependence to be overcome in a healthy and collaborative way, which can be resilient and sustainable for the long term. So for our workshop, we'll be beginning and discussing with these questions. How can we embrace the vulnerability, holism, and strangeness of incarnation in ministry? And how can we share with others that they matter? How we live out Christian community in the current social, cultural, and political context is crucial. And given increasing marginalisation and inequality, the task of promoting personhood and overcoming dependence is central. So I offer the strangeness, vulnerability, and holism of the incarnation, and the gospel of significance that speaks to the other, you matter, as an approach that can enable authentic engagement in response to the gospel with the people and the structures around us. So those are the kind of themes that we'll be picking up on, so feel free to join us in a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Anna. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Professor Paul Cloke to the microphone. Paul is Professor of Human Geography at the University of Exeter. He has wide-ranging research interests in social and cultural geographies. His emphasis is to ground social and cultural theory in particular places, practices, and performances, thus developing geographical interpretations which are relevant to the politics and sensibilities of every day. Paul.
That means I have to give you at least 3 apologies, and I only had 2 to begin with. I have to apologise for that introduction, which was, I don't know where that came from. Did I write that? I'd hope not. No. Okay, the second apology is that I'm coughing and spluttering, so apologies for that. Thirdly, but mostly, I'm not an Anglican. I'm really sorry. If that's going to be a disappointment, you know, I live with it. You know, if you want to know where my spirituality is, it's somewhere between actively being involved in a vineyard church in Exeter and Greenbelt, which I love. So if you can kind of co-locate between those 2 things, you'll find Paul there. As Chris has said, I'm a human geographer, and I spend a lot of time in my work life trying to persuade social scientists of the empirical reality of faith at work in our society. And I'm beginning to see that some of my colleagues and people that I work within in social science who have been so skeptical about this kind of thing are beginning to realise the empirical reality of who is it down there at the coalface doing the dirty work in our cities and also in the countryside. Who is it? It's mostly religious folk, as they would see them. And so that kind of empirical reality is really important. So our workshop, Chris and I are doing, involves the idealistic possibility of post-secularity, the idea that Christians and other religious folk and people who have no particular religion can come to work together, can find commonality in certain kinds of ethical and social and even political arenas. And people are noticing now that there's something going on out there in things like London Citizens, where this is the archetypal example that people use, but you've got multi-faith and no faith. You've got reasonable politics and you've got Boris Johnson and these people coming together around a particular theme, particularly around the kind of living wage and so on. This is the idealism that possibly we're beginning to notice happening in our society. Not just in London Citizens, but in several national and international campaigns where equally different kinds of organisations, religious or not religious, are coming together around a particular thematic. And then, of course, in those local spaces of care, of course, faith-based organisations are out there doing things and badging it as Christian or as something else. But what's also happening is that those places become a kind of catalyst where other kind of people join in. And there is this kind of joining together happening in different parts of society, particularly in the areas of social care, social justice, social welfare, but also in other kinds of ideas. So we're interested in this idea of post-secularity and the opportunity that it brings for our cities and our wider society. Now, part of this is about taking theological ethics out there and finding that other people's ethics aren't necessarily too different. And the lesson from London Citizens is that certain things, people involved in that have had to leave at the door. They're too divisive. But there are these commonalities. And as we've been hearing this morning, the whole idea that we can start to kind of provide pictures of what's something that's ethically in common are really important for our society. And so the idea that theological ethics can come along actually allow us to start to look at some of the kind of normatives that can underpin post-secularity. We don't have to give our faith away. We don't have to give our theologies away. Our theology comes into the public sphere and it finds a meeting place somewhere. So it can produce a kind of ethical agreement in certain places. It can produce certain kind of aesthetics and the ways in which that can empower these kinds of things. So what the research that we've been doing is to begin to see that there are certain kinds of places where you can participate in common with other kinds of people. I don't want to use the word other too much because it just creates another category. And where you can perform your faith alongside others who are performing other faiths or faith in something else, not necessarily religious. Out of that comes the possibility for ethical and political agreement, maybe the possibility that you can set certain kinds of things aside. And the bottom one is just to remind me that, of course, post-secularity can lead almost anywhere. It can lead to a very kind of conservative morality, but it can also lead to progressive, kind of more leftist kind of politics that would be the ones that I would be interested in. In the seminar, or in the workshop, we're going to look at 4 kinds of contexts and try and understand how these contexts are both prompting this idea of post-secularity and the ways in which we can partner with people who don't necessarily believe what we believe. The first of those contexts is, of course, the ways in which governance at the moment is very much about austerity and about the shrinking of the welfare state, and the ways in which both faith-based organisations and more post-secular movements have to fill the gap. And whether or not by doing that, all you're just doing is the work of government. You're becoming incorporated in something you wouldn't want to necessarily be incorporated in. Or whether you can, in small ways and big ways, resist that movement through these kinds of participations. So that's one set of contexts. The second is definitely about the changing role of religion in the public sphere, which we've heard a lot about. It's not just about ideas, it's not just about discourses. It is about this possibility of campaigning and doing and then finding common crossovers with other groups of people. Thirdly, the idea of post-secularity itself, which is not a fixed idea in any sense. I want to stress, even though Chris writes books called The Post-Secular City, I think it's much more sporadic than that. I don't think Chris thinks that, but he just wants to sell his books, so therefore he has to kind of have that title in it. But it's kind of bubbling up here and there. It's not like whole cities become this, but there are particular spaces and particular moments where people kind of take on the subject of being post-secular, of crossing this over. If you want to, we can get into Klaus Eder's philosophy of how we learn together. If you want to, we can talk Jürgen Habermas, but we've done that already this morning. Maybe we'll skip that over. But the whole idea that somehow we have to kind of be mutually reflexive with other people. We have to listen. We have to know where people are coming from in order to find points of commonality and so on and so forth. We won't necessarily dwell on that. And the fourth context is about these kind of new kinds of politics, new kinds of ethical expressions. Whether or not, as William Connolly has talked about, there is an emerging pluralism that we can be an effective part on, not as the thin end of a wedge for our faith, but as an amazing opportunity to make our faith work out there in public. And that kind of plurality may be possible as the state shifts its understanding of what is secular and what can be accommodated within its own way, and certainly as a device for care. So our questions will be about, is this just about talking, or is it about actually getting involved and practicing, and how do those fit together? I think Chris and I sort of think that you learn this as you go along, as you practice this kind of activity, so you understand more of what it is to be post-secular and to have those kind of ethics formed within that. And as you form partnerships with people and actually work at stuff together, so you work that kind of thing through. Secondly, we're interested in what kind of context do these partnerships or rapprochements make? Do they work better in some fields than others? How does that actually work in practice? What's the practice of it? And how do you kind of sustain it? Thirdly, what kind of impact does it make? Is it possible that we can actually change things through these kinds of broad-based coalitions, as well as through just things that we badge as Christian or through other religion? And fourthly, is it possible that through this there may be some kind of possibility for wider change to speak into this notion of wider hospitality, wider ideas of partnership, working with people, rather than somehow opposing them across boundaries? So that will be our workshop, and please join us if you're interested. Thank you.
So thank you very much to our 4 speakers. I hope you've now got a clear idea which workshop you want to go to. We've got about 50 minutes to have conversations with each other. Tea is served at 3:30, but if you want to carry on longer, just pick up a cup of tea when you finish. But our final panel session will begin at 4:45. Just to say that unfortunately there are limits to the numbers of people we can have in the upstairs room. So there's a limit of 20 in the small room, and there's a limit of 30 in the coal store. So if there is an issue around more people than the space permits, I'm afraid it's a first come, first served basis. Charlotte, have I missed anything out? Lovely, thank you. Please go and find your workshops.